Those who go into this cave with me will be saved from the poisonous, radioactive fallout that will follow the nuclear bomb attack. This cave is what led our church to migrate to this little valley from Indianapolis, Indiana. We have gathered in Redwood Valley for protection, and after the war is over, we will be the only survivors. It will be up to our group to begin life anew on this continent. Then we will begin a truly ideal society. People will care about one another. Elderly people will be made to feel needed and will be allowed to be productive. There will at last be peace on earth. I have seen this all by divine revelation. None of these groups pictured itself as actively bringing about the millennium. They did not take up arms, but instead retreated in one form or another from the real world. Some groups, though, are more passive than others. Melanesians, Melanesians, under colonial rule, and North America Indians in the last century would have been suicidal to have framed their vision in more aggressive terms. The Mormons, on the other hand, were openly antagonistic, but even they were vague about the actual mechanism of the final confrontation. They warned their neighbors that it was imminent, and they went so far as to engage in petty thievery and combat, yet they never actually elaborated on their vision of the millennium. The sense of impotence in both messianic and fairy tales is underscored by the generic quality of the protagonists. The saved remained faceless and nameless. In fairy tales, too, as Bethlehem points out, typical titles are Beauty and the Beast, the fairy tale of one who went forth to learn fear. If names appear, it is quite clear that these are not proper names, but general or descriptive ones. We are told that because she always looked dusty and dirty, they called her Cinderella. Or a little red cap suited her so well that she was always called Little Red Cap. As a side note, doesn't this sound familiar of the New Age and even many religions to give a new name, which what it does is it weakens the person's identity so they can be further influenced by others' ideas. In millenarian tales, the protagonists are not fully drawn characters, but stereotypes. If anything, the saved are more vaguely described than the damned. The latter are at least a colorful, attributed with the characteristics of despised groups within the culture. In the millenarian vision of the Third Reich, for example, the damned had hooked noses and jingling pockets. In Ayatollah Khomeini's movement, Western dress, education, and customs constitute telltale signs of satanic poison. The image of Satan, in short, is malleable, a cutout doll upon whom specific attributes can be imposed, lending itself to all sorts of projections and identifications. There is a difference, however, between the characterization in millenarian visions and that in fairy tales. The child's need for revenge, for winning against formidable enemies, must remain secret, and the evil stepmothers and witches anonymous. The child himself is not conscious of his own projections. To recognize or name these adversaries would create intolerable conflict, for they are simultaneously adversaries and loved ones. The value of the fairy tale is that it allows for the expression of anger and resentment in a permissible way. Anonymity protects both the child and the objects of his anger. The followers of a messianic cult, however, need not refrain from naming their enemies. Unlike the child, they are not intimately bound up with or dependent on the objects of their wrath, so the targeting of their anger is cathartic. Thus, in the millenarian vision, Satan always or often has a distinct name and identity. Revenge is at the heart of these stories, and it is a neat, symmetrical revenge. The wolf in Little Red Riding Hood has his belly sewn up with rocks. Hansel and Gretel's witch ends up in the oven. The white trespassers in Melanesia are drowned in the sea from which they so mysteriously arrived. The revenge is childlike, without mercy. Roles are simply reversed. The bullied become bullies. Red Riding Hood does not attempt to rehabilitate the wolf, put a little leash on him, and take him for nature walks. The happy endings of fairy tales confirm the simplicity of their vision, yet they are oddly empty. The kingdom won at the end of the story, like the Melanarian dream, is nondescript. Its main characteristic, according to Bedelham, is that we are never told anything about it, not even what the king or queen does. There is no purpose to being the king or queen of this kingdom other than being a ruler rather than the ruled. To have become a king or queen at the conclusion of the story symbolizes a state of true independence in which the hero feels so secure, satisfied, and happy as the infant in his most dependent state when he was truly well taken care of in the kingdom of his cradle. In the Melanarian kingdom, the saved live in a paradise on earth where, quote, there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away, end quote. How they live, how they rule, and what ruling entails is conspicuously absent in these tales. All we are told is that the previously existing power relations have been reversed. It is assumed that merely having the power has been so long denied. It is assumed that merely having the power that's been so long denied will bring happiness. The reunion with dead ancestors and the eradication of death altogether figure strongly in many Melanarian visions and parallel Bedelheim's appraisal of fairy tales as a metaphorical return to infancy. For here too separation is abolished forever. One is never alone again. In a simple way, both fairy tales and messianic visions are accounts of wishful thinking, about getting even, achieving power, being loved and protected. As the vagueness of their goals reveal, they are not strategies for practical behavior, but fantasies in which the desired wish irrationally comes about. In the fairy tale, this vagueness is understandable. The child has no idea of what is actually involved in being a king or queen, the symbols of successful adulthood, except that it is desirable. The outside world is imagined as a gigantic projection of family life, and the exotic adventures of fairy tales are nothing more than the thinly camouflaged exploration of those intimate relationships. The messianic fantasy, however, pertains to adults, not children, yet the worldview it projects is that of a child. The security promised is the reward for complete dependence on a glorified Father who rules his kingdom with supreme, if benevolent, authority. Here, too, paradise is envisioned as a family. There is false modesty in this vision of the world. For although all power and authority are vested in a remote Father, he is perceived as totally absorbed by the doings of his children. One's need to feel as though one were the center of the universe reveals an insecurity about the real position one occupies in the world. It is a common phenomenon among children who have no other status outside of the family. The size of the world and one's place in it seem inversely proportionate to the degree of personal security one feels. The peculiar mixture of humility and egocentrism is nowhere more evident than in the fairy tales where the monumental size ascribed to adversaries reflects simultaneously the child's sense of being overwhelmed by the world and his own ultimate place at its center. The radical fluctuations of perceived size from invisible to gigantic, best described in Alice in Wonderland, express the distorted perspective of children whose relationship to the outside world is so uncertain. The need to be larger than life, to be embarked on an all-important, earth-shaking mission to compensate for the lowly or unsatisfactory status occupied in real life, is critical to the followers of the messianic movements. Their jealousy guard their role as elect, for it is in this role that they have managed to accept and reintegrate themselves in reality. Their identity is tentative, hinged on the exaggerated proportions of Satan. For adults, the concept of the millennium as an eternal, happy family constitutes a violent step backward. Here, unlike Alice, who grows and diminishes in relation to others, the world itself shrinks to become a tottering stage on which enormous heroes act out carefully rehearsed parts. Despite the magnitude of their proportion, the players are only stick figures, the stock symbols of a morality play, good and evil, Christ and the Antichrist, the saved and the damned. The fantasy reflects an overwhelming need to make the world manageable again. It succeeds by isolating confusing aspects of experience and treating them as though they were discrete entities. Evil is projected onto scapegoats who become its symbols. At various times and to various groups in 20th century America, communists, Jews, bankers, atheists, Zionists, the British, and the Eastern aristocracy have been as instantly recognizable as the wolf in children's fairy stories. Ambiguity is so intolerable that unacceptable aspects of the self are magically eliminated by this process of separation and projection. Believers in the messianic vision reject those parts of themselves that threaten their new identity. Moonies, for example, attribute any doubts about the unification church to the pernicious intrusion of Satan. The peculiar symmetry between Christ and the Antichrist, the saved and the damned, is that they are polar ends of a dialectical vision, each end defined by reference to its opposite. A similar process occurs in fairy tales, where complex or ambivalent feelings are split and projected onto distinct images. The division into opposites is a basic human function, as well as a major function of myth. The infant learns to distinguish and identify an object only by learning what it is not. We have all seen small children who have just mastered recognition of a new object go painstakingly around a room to a variety of objects, proudly pointing out and delighted these are not the newly learned object. Bettelheim writes, this is also how the fairy tale depicts the world. Figures are ferocity incarnate or unselfish benevolence. An animal is either all-devouring or all-helpful. Every figure is essentially one-dimensional, enabling the child to comprehend its actions and reactions easily. Through simple and direct images, the fairy story helps the child sort out his complex and ambivalent feelings so that these begin to fall, each one into a separate place, rather than being all in one big muddle. This just reminds me of different groups that I have seen, that the leader is the one that is clarifying all of these different roles, all of these different feelings, different functions in society as good or bad, and different feelings as third dimension or fourth dimension or fifth dimension, or ones that you should have or ones that you should not have. And he is like this all-knowing God that is, teaching you something that you wouldn't have the brains to do on your own because you're sort of like a child. So let me continue. It is also common for children to split the image of a parent into two separate feelings. The good mother, for example, and an entirely different person who just pretends to be the mother. The imposter, unlike the mother, is often angry and critical of the child, behavior that the child cannot comprehend or integrate with the person of his real mother. This device not only resolves intolerable contradictions, but it also alleviates the guilt the child would otherwise feel towards his, quote, good mother. He is able to direct his anger entirely against the imposter, keeping the good mother inviolate. Bettelheim says the child not only splits a parent into two figures, but he may also split himself into two people who he wishes to believe have nothing in common with each other. I have known young children who during the day are successfully dry but wet their bed at night, and waking up move with disgust to a corner and say with conviction, "Somebody's wet my bed." The child does not do this, as parents may think, to put the blame on somebody else, knowing all the while that it was he who urinated in the bed. The somebody who has done it is that part of himself with which he has now parted company. This aspect of his personality has actually become a stranger to him. This is almost identical to the adult who denies certain aspects of himself as the intrusion of an outside evil force, thus preserving his self-image by eradicating all unacceptable feelings. This natural solution is mirrored endlessly in the wicked stepmothers, witches, and good fairy godmothers of fairy tales. The dreadful ends may be bad parents. Meat in these stories are wholly unsatisfying, for they involve neither guilt nor responsibility. Fairy tales are pointedly make-believe, and all mayhem is vicarious. The child need never consciously realize just why fairy tales are so compelling. The messianic vision also manages to legitimize antisocial feelings, and like the fairy tale, it absolves its followers of responsibility. The revenge depicted in the vision is considered to be fated by God. The followers who certainly benefit at the expense of the damned absolve themselves from any guilt through their pervasive passivity. By projecting their own desires onto a God who then takes matters into his own hands, they manage to satisfy their need for revenge and remain morally impeccable. Both messianic visions and fairy tales occupy that peculiar mythical space at the edge of the psyche and speak a language that is neither exclusively internal monologue nor external discourse, but both simultaneously. They are symbolic narratives that create a context for the examination and the articulation of certain problems. They are fables that concern, among other things, identity and dependence. They use similar psychological and mental processes because a similar state of mind has made them necessary in the first place. The child and the follower of the messianic vision feel overwhelmed by the world and are struggling to understand and integrate themselves into it. Both, for different reasons, lack grounding, a solid connectedness and a place in reality. Messianic visions and fairy tales are the fragile attempts to cope. The child's only sure link to the outside world is through his family, which is why, even when the fairy tale climaxes with the achievement of independence, independence can only be imagined in familial terms. The adult, disappointed in a reality that has not lived up to his expectations, projects in the messianic vision a solution that also symbolizes a return to the family. But where the child is hopeful, identifying adulthood with happiness and success, the follower of a messianic vision fantasizes about becoming a child again. Nor does the fairy tale attempt to foist itself off as reality. It makes sure, by way of cautionary preambles, that the child realizes that the story is make-believe. In fact, by disclaiming any relation to reality, the fairy tale frees the listener to project, identify, and fantasize without inhibition. It allows a child to enjoy revenge and vindication without the burden of guilt. For the fairy tale insists that it is nothing more than entertainment. The messianic vision, on the other hand, asserts that it is an accurate representation of reality and it insulates its followers from any other. Given the rigidity of its vision, it is not liberating but doctrinaire and dangerous. It is one thing to suggest, by way of parable, that anger is legitimate and justifiable. It is another to imply that this anger may be legitimately acted out without qualms of conscience. Both the messianic vision and the fairy tale offer hope as well as a wonderful new identity. But here, too, despite similarities, they are at cross purposes. The fairy tale gives the child courage to explore the world and to discover a place for himself in it by reducing the world and its inhabitants to manageable, one-dimensional proportions. This device is constructive in the context of a child's limited ability to perceive and comprehend. It is anything but in the context of adult listeners. The simplistic vision of the messianic prophecy would make most adults blush. A world inhabited by good people and bad people, with nothing in between. Even the individual has been eliminated. All that is left is a group identity, for the self has been effaced, ostensibly for the cause. At the end of the fairy tale, the hero becomes an individual, a successful adult who happily rules his kingdom. The child in the fairy tale and in the natural course of life succeeds as parent. In the messianic vision, he doesn't, and instead returns to the childhood fold where adulthood, like some hideous burden, is thankfully abdicated forever after.